The Goldenrod Protocols by James Oliver, copyright 2023.
A few townsfolk shuffled to and fro, some more similar to what Jack might have defined as people than others. The light of life in their eyes was less fluorescent than the checks in Lenape Square, but brighter nonetheless. A smiling old woman said hello to him. She was toned and spry, her back straight and her legs carrying her with no real trouble. Her short, curly gray hair was full and vibrant, the rims of her glasses a striking blue. The colors on her graphic tee faded to match her jeans. 70 is the new 40. He smiled and said hi, and for that instant felt a little like he was home. Across the street, past the ancient green and red traffic light, was a corner with an open space where he might have expected a building. Instead, there was a small, inviting brick plaza lined by entrances to colorful, authentic, warm little shops. No boards or steel shutters, each asleep for the night but alive, as if the legacy towners had resolved to keep them that way. These shops are important. An ornate tower stood in the center of the plaza, topped by two decorative lights and a cast-iron eagle spreading its wings. The bricks were real, not the knockoffs he might have found in the world where he lived. He'd seen a place like it in a painting, or maybe someone's vacation photos from Tuscany. Wherever he saw it before, he'd wanted to be there. It was an anchor for his soul. I'm close. He made it another block or two before he noticed the chipped green paint that still kind of spelled Conrad's Tavern on a sign hanging over a green wooden door. He stepped back to see the 50-year-old neon signs for ancient beers in the unwashed windows and the color falling off the walls. He couldn't make out the music coming from the other side, but it called him further nonetheless. Conrad's was what it was, not what some arbitrary person decided it should be. This is it. This is where I'll find it. On the other side of that door would be real people having real interactions and enjoying real human connection. There'd be no artificial truths. No one would hide behind a mask or chase moving targets for points. They were poor, they were forgotten, they were powerless. But they were free. Adventure awaited. Jack pressed his palm against the warped paint, freezing in horror when his bracelet reflected the light from the greasy window. He yanked it off his wrist, shoved it in his pocket, braced himself for the joy he imagined he'd find behind the door, and pushed it open. The music rushed into his soul and his mind went somewhere else. He'd never heard anything like it before. It awakened memories he wasn't sure were real, but desperately wanted to live again. In his high, he barely noticed the glint of gold on the worn threshold as he stepped onto a modest dance floor abutted by high-top tables. Tattered pennants for defunct sports teams hung with impotent pride from the ceiling beams. Strings of light bulbs clung stapled to the tops of the walls, rudely interrupted by clunky speakers for the dancers who'd come later. Arcane posters and thick wood-framed mirrors dressed up in fading decals peppered the green and orange walls above the once white wainscoting. A bright glow from the room on the side polluted the calm, dim lighting in the main space. He peered in to see pool tables, dartboards on the far wall, and two bathroom doors in back next to a jukebox and a woman standing in front of it. Her curly reddish hair hid her face, swaying to and fro with her shoulders. Is she dancing or struggling to stand straight? Plumbers, mechanics, and garbage men shot pool or sat around the tables, all laughing together at jokes forbidden among the Czechs. These were the workers who built the new cities, who maintained the buildings and the cars and the trains and all of the machines that made others' life run smoothly. But they weren't welcome in the places that couldn't have existed without them. The cigarette smoke drifted away from their mouths as the music on the makeshift dance floor faded and released him back into this time and place. Hundreds of strident murmurs, a soft popping, a crisp cracking, and disembodied voices came from ahead. He followed the sounds to an archaic sports broadcast playing on the two-dimensional TVs, not hollow stages, hanging above the U-shaped bar along the back wall. He plopped into a stool in a cluster of empty ones at the bar. Part of him beckoned back to the door, through the town and the forest to the shuttle station. But the rest of him never wanted to leave his seat. The bartender hobbled over. He was in his 50s, Jack guessed, and slightly overweight. His white locks flopped across his forehead from hours of leaning and kneeling and sweating. He looks like a Frank. "What can I get you?" Do you have... Actually, what do you have on tap?" Frank pursed his lips while his eyebrows slid north. "Well, we got Western Classic and Schnitzer for $11.75. But we got Columbia Light bottles on special for $10.50 apiece if you're looking for something cheap. Jack had never heard of those. Do you have Pete's Own, or Beers of Joy? A puff of breath burst through what otherwise might have been a smirk on Frank's lips. You're in the wrong place, buddy. Those words felt sharp in Jack's ears until Frank shook his head and chuckled, and Jack realized what he meant. We don't have that fancy stuff here. I guess I'll take a Columbia Light. Frank slid open the refrigerator door and retrieved a brown glass bottle, icy white at the base and covered in dewdrops. He twisted off the cap and slid a cardboard coaster in front of Jack with one calloused hand and set the bottle on top with the other. Jack wrapped his fingers around the cold, wet bottle, tilting it to examine the silver label, an eagle's head over a blue star in the center, between Columbia across the top and Light across the bottom. It was cheap and lazy, not something an E7 would have designed, maybe an E22. Thank you. Him, Frank grunted as he shuffled away. Jack drew the bottle to his lips and took a taste. His tongue recoiled as the contents poured past his lips and fizzled around his mouth. Like seltzer, he told himself, but dry and stale. Cheap, not like the more flavorful beers he was used to. Gross. He grudgingly sucked it down. The rotten funk lingered in his throat after the fizzles disappeared. He remembered the first sip of coffee his father gave him when he was a kid. This is disgusting, he remembered thinking. But he learned to like it. I'll learn to like Prague beer. A baseball game played on the TVs above the bar. His father was an avid Phillies fan until the Abbeys abolished sports for glorifying status and promoting inequitable outcomes. He missed watching the games with him, but it had been so long he forgot many of the particulars. A base runner in a gray uniform ran towards second while the defender, short man, in red pinstripes straddled it, awaiting a throw from near the far wall. The runner slid feet first toward the base, driving his spiked shoes into the short man's shin. No, shortstop. The shortstop dropped to the ground, clutching his leg. Angry cries of, "Oh, come on," and "You gotta be kidding me," buzzed through the bar, as if the outcome of this game hadn't been decided long ago. There was nothing for them in there now, so they lived in this past. That's really uncalled for, the indignant TV announcer groaned. Hopefully he'll be ejected. That was way too aggressive. Yeah, no shit, yelled a grizzly man across the bar. Jack took another sip of his beer. This isn't so bad. He relished the bubbles popping against his lip. How refreshing, one part of him thought. Not just the beer, but the bar and its inhabitants, too. But Claire is waiting for you, remembered the other. He shifted in his stool, unable despite his contentment to shake the feeling he was doing something wrong. I have to go back there. He took another sip and glanced at the patrons around him, nary a link nor an immer sensor to be found. I'm not free like them. But it wasn't just the freedom he coveted. There was something else, something familiar. Their raw, unrestrained true selves, the wanton disregard for reputation, their pure being, uncorrupted by the projections and coercions of others. They remind me of my dad. In his mind's eye, he replaced the faces around him with those of his father and his friends, and the fit was perfect. He wondered if his family would have ended up in Middletown after the reckoning if his father hadn't been so shrewd and resourceful and determined not to drift in the tide. He felt a deep but vague sense of peace, like he was reliving some happy moment he couldn't quite remember. His father might as well have been there with him. He was home. Here comes trouble, Frank shouted as a young woman walked through the door. You know it, she yelled back. She was a few years younger than Jack, no older than 30. The waves of her dyed ginger hair trickled down to her shoulders. There was just a little more of her than there was of Claire, even though she was a few inches shorter. She was a little less delicate, but not much. But she was well-proportioned, toned and in shape, but not too thin. Strong, but soft. She carried herself with confidence and purpose. Tassels hung from the tops of her black boots, just barely covered by a flowing sundress reaching just below her knees. Her mismatching fashion was captivating. Czechs were obsessed with nonconformity, but only the oxymoronic, socially accepted kind where you refused to conform to norms that didn't exist. Czech fashion was a clinic in artificiality, trends adopted by millions to boast their unfettered identities, but solely for the purpose of fitting in. They'd been finessed into putting even more money into the pockets of the same corporate shareholders who took cuts from their paychecks as a return on their social sponsorship investment. But this woman didn't care what anyone thought of her clothing. which would be an unspoken taboo if she were a Czech. She built her outfit from disparate styles and wore it with pride. She was truly an individual, not the illusion of one. He watched from the corner of his eye as she approached and sat next to him. Frank had her cocktail ready before she sat down. "Here you go." Jack heard her thank the bartender and then felt her studying his face. "You're new here." Jack finally looked at her face, pretending just to have noticed her. "Yup, first-timer." Her gaze wandered toward his chin and then lower and lower still before returning to his eyes. So banal, but the novelty shocked his nerves. "We don't get many Czechs in here." She was aloof, like half her mind was in some other world. Her face turned toward her glass for a sip. "What makes you think I'm a Czech?" "I can just tell," she grinned. "Well, I'm not." She raised an eyebrow and challenged him. "Do you have a profile?" "Yeah." "Do you have an aptitude class?" She held her eyes on his, carefully placing a cigarette between her lips as they fought to keep from smiling. Without breaking her gaze, she produced a lighter from her purse. Not the cheap plastic kind you bought at a convenience store, but forged steel with an etching of a dragon on the side. She flipped open the hinged lid and awaited his reply. "Probably, but I couldn't tell you what it is." I found it. The thrill of being someone else and the danger of being caught consumed him. Something about the parts of her eyes around the hazel centers relaxed him. They were pure white, without the usual glaze or red streaks. Her lips curled up without losing her smoke. "Bullshit." The cigarette bounced with both syllables. She sparked the wheel and crossed her eyes toward the flame she'd summoned, bringing it up to the cigarette. She sucked a puff and pointed her eyes back at Jack while a wispy whitish-gray jet blew from the corner of her mouth. "You think just because I live here I don't know how to spot a Czech?" Smart, direct, unfiltered, beautiful. A warm wave washed over him. She gently sucked another drag. "Yes, I have an aptitude class," he admitted, "and yes, I know what it is." A gray cloud burst out with the tiny giggle she let sneak through her smile. "Well then, my friend, you are a Czech," she regretted to inform him. "Where's your bracelet?" "In my pocket," Jack smirked. She giggled again. "Ah, so you're not a red Czech. What does that mean?" "It means you don't believe your bracelet is sacred. You don't bleed devotion," she explained. "No, I don't." There was an awkward pause while he searched for something interesting to say. "You're pretty insightful. That's exactly why they're red." "What, the bracelets?" "Yeah, devotion is supposed to be in your veins." "I see," she smiled. "So what do you believe?" "I don't know." He took a sip but wished it was a drag from a cigarette. "I'm not sure I believe anything. I don't even follow the news." "Why not?" "Nothing they say ever seems right. And I wouldn't even know how to figure it out. Or understand better, so why bother?" She glanced at the game on TV and lifted her cocktail to her chin and asked, "What are you doing here?" before she took a sip. "This." He slid his hand behind her hair, grabbed the back of her head and pulled it close. He planted his lips firmly on hers. He rested his fingers on her thigh and felt her warm skin through the cotton-linen blend. He combed her auburn hair back with his fingers and gripped her leg a little tighter. He felt her rest her palm on his shoulder and slide it up to his cheek just as she gently parted her lips. "Jack, this is Houston. Do you copy?" "What? Oh." He found himself leaning in a bit too far and sat back in. His stool. "Sorry, long day." "I bet. So what are you doing here?" "Just passing through." "No one just passes through Middletown." "Sure they do. It's in the middle," he quipped. She squinted her eyes and smiled sarcastically. "Good one." "Thanks." That was corny. "Are you flirting with her?" "Where are you from?" "Lenape County." He waited longer than he wanted for a reply. "It's in the metro state." "Yeah, I got that," she teased. "The bus from Lenape Square is only for residents. How did you get here?" "This is exhilarating." "I hiked through the forest." "Wow," she blurted. "That's quite the pilgrimage." "It was." He felt warm and calm. "I just needed to get away from there." He looked into her eyes for just a little too long until he had to look down at the cramp in his left hand. It was awkwardly tucked under his right arm and bent at the wrist. It was tensed. His thumb pinned his third finger to his palm and the other strained to cover it. "You're hiding your wedding ring." I'm Molly. She twisted her crossed knees toward him when she held out her hand. Jack's heart beat a little faster. Jack Caulder, K. He caught himself just before stating his class and managed to roll the K into a clearing of his throat. He quickly hid his left hand behind his leg and held out his right hand to shake hers. He inspected it while he wondered if he was squeezing too hard or not hard enough. Her nails were clean but not manicured. There was a tiny scar on her thumb. He'd never paid so much attention to a hand. The guilt crept further. Too long, he realized, and released his clasp. A voice in his head asked, "Where is this going?" And he didn't like any of the answers. "Nice to meet you, Jack." She took another sip of her drink. He glanced at the TV to break the spell her eyes were beginning to cast. The offense and defense had traded places, but she wasn't finished with him. "What's your class?" K9182. What's that mean? Jack sighed. He'd journeyed across the forbidden woods and into the underbelly of the Great Republic, but this dehumanizing string of characters had followed in his shadow. It wrote his story even here, where it shouldn't have been able to exist. It means I have nothing to offer. He paused in recognition that if it hadn't been for the code, he wouldn't be here, talking to her. No creativity, no talent. It means I'm boring. No wonder you came to the in-between. The in-between? Yeah. Here, what do you staters call it? A legacy town? Yeah, he smiled. Legacy town. Why do you say that? Molly took another drag from her cigarette and slowly exhaled. If everyone in my world thought I was boring, I wouldn't want to be there either. She held her eyes on him, but they didn't feel grimy, like Nicholas's, who watched him, whereas Molly truly saw him. Thought? Jack raised his brow and cracked a smirk. She likes you. How do you know I'm not? She gave him another quick look up and down. Right now, I think if you were boring, you wouldn't have gone searching for something else. He felt vulnerable, yet unexpectedly comfortable. Then again, I just met you, so who knows? Something in his chest started to deflate. Her doubt was his doubt, and she seemed to understand. She leaned in to touch his leg. I'm just kidding. Oh, I know. He smirked and chuckled. I don't know,